Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. The U.S. and Israel keep threatening bigger and bigger attacks on Iran. But what's the end game? Let's get to the bottom line. To hear President Donald Trump describe it, the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran is either, quote, very complete or just beginning. In Washington's divided politics, Republicans continue to defend the war, while most Democrats are debating the legality of the war and question its motives and its strategy. As Iranian power is degraded, Tehran carries on with its attacks on Israel and U.S. military and surveillance installations across the Arab countries, along with economic targets that are having consequences for the entire world. So is this turning into an ever-expanding war with no end in sight? Today, we're talking with Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen, who is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. Let me just start out with the obvious first question. Does this action against Iran by the United States conform to American national interest from your perspective?
Absolutely not. This is a war that's making America and our allies less safe. We see constantly shifting rationales, no end game. We've taken the lid off Pandora's box without having any idea where this will land. In the meantime, we've lost 7 American soldiers, others 10 scores wounded, Iranian civilians killed, including scores and scores of Iranian schoolgirls. And we have a president who has no idea where this is going, or a Secretary of Defense who knows what he's doing.
So that's an incredible indictment, what you just said. I don't think I've heard the clarity of that kind of indictment as clearly as you just provided. Is that message being heard by this administration? Is Donald Trump hearing the criticism, both from people like yourself in the Senate, but even some in his own party?
I hope it's punching through to the president, because we all remember when Donald Trump pledged during the campaign to keep America out of foreign wars, especially more wars in the Middle East. And we all know what happened in Iraq. The United States got sucked in. We were there for a long time, and it did not, in my view, serve American interests. And yet Donald Trump has plunged us into the exact same situation. Now, I did hear Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu a little while ago saying he's been waiting 40 years, these are his words, 40 years for this to happen. He just happened to find an American president after 40 years that was stupid enough and reckless enough to do it.
Well, as you said, there have been many rationales that the president said he had for taking action, one being an imminent threat from Iran, the other nuclear rationales, that if we didn't do this, America might be hit by ballistic missiles or might be subject, involved, we would have a nuclear war or conflict of that sort. Secretary of State Marco Rubio came out and said we had information that Israel was about to strike and we needed to strike, meaning the Americans needed to strike to protect our soldiers. Which of these scenarios, given all the players, do you most believe?
Well, I don't know what to believe, but here's what I do know, Steve. Number one, there was no imminent threat, period. I mean, we've heard testimony that Iran was not about to attack the United States. We know that. Number two, Iran was not on the verge of developing a nuclear weapons capacity. After all, it was the president who told the country last year that we'd essentially wiped out their nuclear weapons capacity. So that is not the reason to do it. Now they talk about the ballistic missiles. It's important that Americans understand that there's not a single Iranian missile that can come close to hitting the United States of America. There's never been a question that the United States military could destroy Iran's military. That's not the question. The question is to what end and for what purpose, and does it make America safer, and does it advance our interests? And now we see rising oil prices around the world. We see the president talking about spending $1 billion of American taxpayer dollars every day, and he's talking about coming back and asking for another $50 billion at a time when he tells us that we can't afford to support.
I mean, just take that a step further. They're saying that you're hearing that they're going to make a $50 billion, which is a lot of dollars, folks, supplementary request for this very short term, what they're calling, excursion.
That's what they're saying. It's up to $50 billion. We don't know exactly how much. We do know it's costing at least $1 billion every single day, maybe more. And so these are American taxpayers, and they're going, what the hell is my money going for? It is not making us safer. Every time the administration comes up with a rationale for why it's entered this war, it falls apart. They have no end game. And so people are rightly pissed off, which is why a majority of Americans across the political spectrum oppose this war.
So I want to ask this very carefully. I remember the presidencies of Barack Obama, of Joe Biden. There were military actions during those period of time. I remember when Barack Obama, lamented the fact that he had to, engage in essentially what were extrajudicial killings of people, using missiles to kill those that were perceived to be terrorists around the world, in that manner. And these were controversial. And largely Democrats lined up to support the president. Is it just the nature of the political equation that Republicans will support the Republican president taking provocative action, that Democrats would support a Democratic action, president taking these same sorts of actions? Or is there principle left in the Senate where party lines don't matter?
It absolutely should not be based on the party of the President of the United States requesting military action. And let's go back to Afghanistan. In 2001, there was an authorization to use military force. I wasn't in the Congress at that point in time.
So this was after 9/11?
After 9/11, right? So going after al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, there was AUMF, overwhelming support. I think only one member of Congress did not vote for it. It was justifiable because al-Qaeda had just attacked the United States. Iraq, 2002, also an AUMF, an authorization to use military force in the Senate. It was bipartisan. I wasn't there. I was strongly opposed to it. I was running for Congress at the time. I did not think it served America's interests. But my point, Steve, is you had bipartisan votes in support of those requests from a president. In both cases, you had a Republican president, George Bush, in the White House. So, this should not be based on those things. And again, we rerun the tape. I mean, Donald Trump went after Barack Obama. He said Barack Obama is going to start a war against Iran because he's a lousy negotiator. You can re-roll the tape. Well, here we have it. Barack Obama did not negotiate.
And he said in that time that he wanted to distract from domestic problems.
Exactly. And so here we are, flash forward to today. Barack Obama did not go to war with Iran. In fact, Barack Obama negotiated the JCPOA, which did prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It would have had to be extended and other things, but that was what it accomplished. Donald Trump tears it up in his first term. And now he sends off his great negotiators to Iran, who clearly failed the test that Donald Trump had laid out for Barack Obama. And now we're dragged into this war in Iran.
So let me play devil's advocate again. Isn't there an argument to have been made that this was a right moment for the president to take action?
So no one is mourning the loss of Khomeini. No one's mourning, the loss of taking out some of these Iranian leaders. I was one of the folks who strongly condemned the actions the Iranian government took against its own people and killing protesters. The issue, Steve, is should we really be asking the American people, our servicemen and women, to put their lives on the line for this particular war? And to what end? And what is the end game? And I think everything's telling us that they don't have an end game here. So this isn't a question about whether or not we like regime change in Iran. I would be happy to see a different regime in Iran. The question is, how do you achieve that without harming America's interests? And in my view, they have not met that test right now. And, it is absolutely true that, Iran had lots of dangerous proxies in the region. They still have proxies in neighboring Iraq. The United States has interests in Iraq. So I think the fundamental question is not, is Iran been a malign actor against its own people and in the region? The answer to that question is yes, it has. The question is, should the United States be risking and now sacrificing the lives of American service members and expending all of this treasure on this adventure? And my answer is no. And the majority of the American people are answering no. And Donald Trump, when he was a candidate for president, his answer was hell no. That's why he said he'd keep us out of these foreign wars.
I know that you probably don't watch the MAGA press very much or hear the MAGA voices, but I do also know that, you've got a wide constituency. Have you been surprised by how ferocious the criticism of Donald Trump's actions have been by some of the leaders in the MAGA movement, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like Tucker Carlson, like other media voices, Megyn Kelly and others?
No, because they actually took Donald Trump at his word, and he's completely violated his pledges and his promises, and so they understandably feel completely betrayed. I'm surprised that not more people in the Republican Party are criticizing Donald Trump, because what you have right now is a split between the parts of the MAGA movement that supported Donald Trump's vision, and in some cases that was a very twisted vision in my view, but when it came to keeping us out of foreign wars, that was something that I think many of us could agree with. And those who just say Donald Trump is king, and no matter what he said before, we trust him now. He said he'd keep us out of foreign wars, but by God, I'm with him no matter what he actually does. He said, when he came in, he was going to provide the Epstein files. But once he got in, he tried to hide the Epstein files. Well, if you were serious about what Donald Trump was running for, you're going to be mad, and you should be mad because you've been betrayed.
Let me ask you about the Israel side of this equation. You mentioned Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu finally finding a president who would align with what he wanted to do after a 40 years quest to take down the leadership in Iran. When you think about Israel's aspirations in the region and what it's trying to achieve, what are your thoughts? What are your worries?
Well, it depends on who in Israel you're talking about. I mean, clearly there are some in Israel who see greater Israel as the ultimate goal. As we speak, you're seeing Israeli settlers, violent settlers, pushing more Palestinians off their lands on the West Bank, destroying crops. You've got the recent announcements within the last several weeks about greater ability for Israelis to take over Palestinian lands. Hell, you've got our own ambassador, Huckabee, saying in response to interview question that, it'd be, quote, fine with him if Israel not only takes over the West Bank, but other areas where some would claim the Bible gives Israel the right to essentially take. So there is that element about the long-term goal. In terms of these particular actions that the Netanyahu government is taking, look, its goal is to weaken its adversaries. But the reality is, in the case of Iran, Iran had already been significantly weakened. It was probably at its weakest point in decades, partly, as we've discussed, because its proxies had been weakened. So their goal apparently is regime change. That's why the Israeli attack, the first attack, was to try to decapitate the Iranian leadership. They obviously got a lot of them. But again, the question is, to what end? Now Khamenei's son is the heir apparent. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard is probably even more empowered. Are they militarily weakened? Yeah, but what's the end game?
I think when you sort of talk about the end game and the way in which we now hear in response to rising gas prices and others, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, you've got President Trump basically saying this is going to end soon. You can sort of find evidence that maybe there are other parts of the government acting like it's not going to end very soon. But when you're in something like that, it raises the question of who's driving the war, who's driving the conflict and contain it. And I'm just interested in, does Iran have any interest in bringing this to a close now, given what's happened, given the assassination of its leader, given what it sees happening? Does in your assessment, As I know, the assessments they've given previous presidents, watch out for the unexpected escalation to regional conflict that could really happen if you you make a conflict happen without preparing well. We clearly didn't prepare well. So are you worried about that much, much worse scenario evolving?
So the short answer is yes. And look, in my view, Steve, Iran would like the war to end now, but that's a different question than whether they're willing to make the concessions and meet the demands of Donald Trump.
Of unconditional surrender.
Of unconditional surrender, or Donald Trump saying, I'm going to pick your leader, and this guy's not acceptable to me, so I'm going to keep going. So Iran, in my view, is not going to do that. And so either Donald Trump backs off, and, he keeps signaling, as you said, maybe this is going to be over tomorrow. It could be shorter, which all just goes to reinforce the point that the Trump administration doesn't have a damn clue as to what its ultimate goal is. There was never an issue, again, about whether or not we had the capacity to degrade the Iranian military. I mean, obviously, we have a superior military force, and the question has not been that. The question is, again, to what end and at what sacrifice and at what risk and at what cost, both in lives, but also treasure.
You mentioned the kind of religious dimensions of this, of what Ambassador Mike Huckabee has, ascribed. And we see some, I mean, for me, this is sort of uncomfortable to talk about, but I'm going to lay it out there, that there are now 8 states in the U.S. that have agreed to begin using the terms Judea and Samaria instead of West Bank in their official documents. Inside the United States, you've got complaints from military in the field right now, and I want to read this carefully, that some of the commanders of these soldiers are saying that President Trump has been anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran to cause Armageddon and mark his return to earth. I mean, these are serious legal complaints by soldiers in the field today, fighting in the armed services of this country, saying that this is happening. So I'm sure legal process will be there. I can't imagine myself asking this question, but is there a religious zealotry dimension to what we're seeing unfold being released by the United States in this region?
I think there is an element of that because I have also seen those reports. We've also seen, as we were discussing, our own Ambassador Huckabee invoking the Bible to justify his vision of the Middle East, or Prime Minister Netanyahu's vision of the Middle East. We see here at home in the United States a vicious attack on Muslim Americans by many in the Republican Party. We need to quickly denounce those efforts.
You had a member of Congress. You had a member of Congress from Tennessee who came out and said Muslims should not be citizens.
Exactly.
So how has the reaction to that been? I mean, you were a member of the House before you became a member of the Senate. What's the temperature like among Republicans and Democrats for a statement like that?
Well, a person who said something like that would be driven out of Congress if he said it about any other faith. And it is really despicable that the Speaker of the House, when asked, did not condemn the remark. I mean, this is somebody who has no business, in my view, serving in the United States Congress. If he doesn't understand the Constitution of the United States, including our provisions and our amendments with respect to religious liberty. So I do think that this whole conversation has been in part, and I want to say in part, shrouded in this kind of religious war. And there are a lot of voices.
One of your colleagues, Senator Lindsey Graham, is shrouding it in the same kind of scaffolding.
He does, and if you listen, Lindsey Graham obviously is in regular communication with Prime Minister Netanyahu. If you listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he often invokes this religious imagery and very strong anti-Muslim comments as part of his rhetoric and part of his narrative. So I would just urge the Arab countries in the region and Muslim countries, non-Arab countries, that they really need to push back on that narrative coming out of parts of the Trump administration and others, because the last thing the world needs is a religious war. And I think it's really important that leaders pull back from that kind of poisonous division.
Senator Lindsey Graham, just mentioned again, just talked about the American embassy in Riyadh being evacuated. He writes, question, why should America do a defense agreement with a country like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that is unwilling to join a fight of mutual interest? And he basically ends it with hope this changes soon. If not, consequences will follow. So we're broadening the threat from the United States to another major party and anchor of Middle East. How does this kind of brinksmanship and attitude not result in raising anxieties, raising fears? I mean, how do you get back to any kind of order and stability with this sort of rhetoric?
I think it's hard. And that's why I urge the Arab countries in the region to listen very carefully to what different people here in the United States are saying. I mean, it's been pretty much an open secret, maybe not even a secret, that what we're seeing from Senator Graham these days is simply him becoming a mouthpiece for Prime Minister Netanyahu, and quite openly, in fact. And what is interesting is to see Donald Trump being persuaded by many of these influences, including apparently from Senator Graham. So I think, going around and threatening our neighbors, not our neighbors, but some of our partners in the Middle East, which I often have differences with, just to be clear, in terms of their positions and policies. But threatening them when they cautioned and warned the Trump administration against launching a war against Iran. They made it clear, apparently, that if a war started, they would provide some assistance. And of course, they've been targeted themselves. I mean, Saudi Arabia has been targeted, others in the Gulf have been targeted. But it doesn't serve our interests to go around threatening those countries at this particular point in time when they warned, apparently, reportedly, about the folly of just going off and starting a war with Iran when you don't know what your end game is and you don't know what the consequences are going to be. As I've said, you're going to take the lid off Pandora's box and put all Americans at risk on this adventure where you have no idea what your end game is.
Let me ask you about the day after. Every conflict, there's a day after. One of the casualties of these times, I think, are international institutions of justice, the International Court of Justice, the various international players that have been trying to weigh in on this or another. Is there a day of reckoning in the future when political orders change, where things like the killing of 164 young girls in Iran by apparently a U.S. missile call for accountability? Is there accountability against Israeli leaders for a lot of what we've seen, not only now, but in Gaza, tens of thousands of innocent people killed, not just those they were trying to attack? I'm interested in whether or not, as we've seen in previous horrible conflicts on this planet, there was a reckoning, people were held accountable, and these international norms of justice were applied to those people who preceded. Are Americans and Israelis and others in that lineup for future reckoning?
I think this is a fundamental question. And the answer to this question is going to sort of shape what kind of future we have. In my view, there should be accountability. There should be accountability for the actions the Netanyahu government took in Gaza, which has been pretty much leveled. And we haven't talked much about where we're going to go next in Gaza, but we still have a humanitarian crisis there. We still have.
We have the board of peace.
We have the board of peace. We have, phase 2, which is supposed to be Hamas disarmament, but also Israeli compliance with the other elements, including Palestinian governance and ultimately connecting Gaza with the West Bank. But we also need accountability across the board. So I just led a letter signed by pretty much every member of the Senate Democratic Caucus but one to Hexeth about the strike against the Iranian school that's killed roughly 150 Iranian school girls. This is after Pete Hegseth has been dismantling the structures within the Defense Department. They're intended to limit civilian harm. Yes, we have to be prepared to fight a war and go after the militaries, the adversaries' militaries. But we've been working for years to do so in a way that limits civilian harm. And he just blew that up. In fact, it was Hegseth who said these are stupid rules of engagement. Rules of engagement are designed to prevent war crimes. I also think European leaders are really dropping the ball in this moment. I mean, I really appreciated the speech that the Canadian Prime Minister gave in Geneva about the attacks from the Trump administration on the world order. But then he immediately signs up in support of the war in Iran. And we've seen very tepid pushback among European leaders to what clearly was a violation of international law. I mean, there's no question that the United States and Israel started this war. There was no imminent threat, and they just went off and started a war. That's clearly a violation of international law. So to get to the bottom of your question, if we don't have some mechanisms for accountability, we are going to be condemned to live in a world without any kind of rules. And the United States has seen it, even as a great power, we've seen it to our benefit to have these rules. And the Trump administration has just torn them up. And everybody in the world, especially our European partners, need to push back much more strongly.
We're going to have to leave it there. Senator Chris Van Hollen, member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Democrat from Maryland, thank you so much for joining us. Very sobering. Appreciate you being here.
Good to be with you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Some Americans might remember election night 2024 when President Trump said, "I'm not going to start another war. I'm going to stop wars." Since then, he's co-launched 2 wars with Israel against Iran, did a grab-and-go attack in Venezuela, several hit-and-runs with the Houthis, bombed Nigeria and threatened more if Christians are killed there, killed more than 100 people on alleged drug boats in the Caribbean, plus assorted smatterings in Somalia, in Syria, and Iraq. He got little to no blowback from all of those. So maybe he's just shocked that this war in Iran is more complex and expensive than he thought, and maybe he doesn't have advisors who can warn about unpredictable outcomes and expanding confrontations. We're already there now, in unknown territory. And so far, it doesn't look like Donald Trump will be able to control this war as he expected. And that's the bottom line.